The sound of drums echoed through the highlands of Ethiopia, stirring a nation that had long been a symbol of resilience in the face of colonial ambitions. The year was 1896, and the world watched as one of the most significant struggles for sovereignty unfolded in the heart of Africa. On one side stood the Kingdom of Italy, an imperial power eager to expand its dominion and secure its place among the great colonial empires of Europe. On the other, Ethiopia, led by Emperor Menelik II, a sovereign nation that had survived centuries of foreign attempts to undermine its independence. What would follow would forever alter the course of African history, a turning point that would defy expectations and shatter the illusions of European invincibility. In the late 19th century, the so-called scramble for Africa was in full swing. European powers had carved up the continent into colonies, dividing its peoples and resources with little regard for the cultures or boundaries that had existed for centuries. For most African nations, this period was marked by violence, exploitation, and the erosion of their sovereignty. Ethiopia, however, stood as an anomaly. Unlike the majority of Africa, which had been colonized by European powers, Ethiopia had maintained its independence for centuries, fending off foreign invaders as they sought to impose their rule. This rich history of resistance was not merely a product of military prowess, but of a deeply ingrained sense of national identity and unity that had endured through centuries of change. By the 1890s, Italy had ambitious plans to expand its holdings in Africa. After initial attempts at establishing a colony in Eritrea had proven relatively successful, Italy turned its attention to Ethiopia, a land that had resisted foreign rule for centuries. The Italian government, under Prime Minister Francesco Crispi, saw an opportunity to make up for past failures and secure prestige on the global stage by conquering Ethiopia. However, Italy's imperial ambitions would meet fierce resistance in the form of Emperor Menelik II. Menelik was no stranger to the intricacies of diplomacy and warfare. Ascending to the throne in 1889, he was acutely aware of the danger posed by European colonial powers, particularly Italy. His first major challenge had been the Treaty of Wuchel, signed in 1889 between Italy and Ethiopia. The treaty, which was meant to regulate the relations between the two countries, contained an ambiguous clause regarding the control of Ethiopia's foreign policy. The Italian version of the treaty implied that Ethiopia would become a protectorate of Italy, subject to its influence in international affairs, while the Amharic version, which Menelik had signed, did not contain such language. This discrepancy would later become a key factor in the conflict that would lead to war. Tensions escalated in the years following the signing of the Treaty of Wuchel. Italy sought to enforce its interpretation of the treaty, attempting to limit Ethiopia's sovereignty and manipulate its foreign relations. Menelik, however, remained steadfast in his commitment to Ethiopia's independence. His resolve was strengthened by a growing sense of unity among the Ethiopian people, who, despite their diverse ethnicities and languages, rallied around the idea of preserving their nation's sovereignty. Menelik's leadership and diplomatic efforts were crucial in uniting the various factions within Ethiopia, who might otherwise have been divided by regionalism or internal disputes. In 1895, Italy's military aggression began in earnest. In response to Ethiopian resistance to their demands, Italian forces launched a full-scale invasion. Italy had an overwhelming military advantage, with modern weapons, better-trained soldiers, and the backing of a European empire. The Italians expected a quick and easy victory, but they underestimated the resolve and military prowess of the Ethiopian people. Menelik, aware of the Italian threat, began to mobilize his forces, drawing on Ethiopia's long history of defending its land from foreign invaders. His army, while less equipped with modern artillery, was no less determined, and the leadership of Menelik and his generals played a critical role in organizing the resistance. The Ethiopian military was bolstered by the unity that Menelik had fostered among the various regional factions. Menelik's efforts to bring together a coalition of ethnic groups, including the Amhara, Oromo, Tigray, and others, were essential in creating a unified front against the Italian invasion. The diverse nature of the Ethiopian army reflected the strength of the nation itself, a nation that had survived for centuries because of its ability to adapt and integrate various cultural and regional forces into a single, cohesive unit. As the Italians advanced toward the Ethiopian heartland, the conflict became a battle not just for territory, but for the very survival of Ethiopia as a sovereign state. The Ethiopian people were fighting not only to defend their land, but to protect their way of life, their culture, and their independence. This was a battle for the future, one that would define Ethiopia's place in the world and send a resounding message to the colonial powers who thought they could carve up Africa at will. The first significant confrontation came at the Battle of Amba Alajai in late 1895, where Ethiopian forces, despite being outnumbered, managed to deliver a resounding defeat to the Italian troops. This victory bolstered Ethiopian morale and gave Menelik and his generals the confidence they needed to continue the fight. Yet the Italians were undeterred, continuing their march toward the capital, Addis Ababa. The struggle would culminate in the Battle of Adwa, a confrontation that would go down in history as one of the most significant victories in African resistance against European colonialism. In the lead-up to the Battle of Adwa, Menelik's army continued to grow in size and strength as Ethiopians from all corners of the empire joined the fight. The Italian forces, meanwhile, were stretched thin, with logistical difficulties and internal disagreements undermining their efforts. Despite their superior weaponry, the Italians were increasingly on the defensive, struggling to maintain control over the territories they had occupied. The Ethiopians, by contrast, had the advantage of knowing the terrain and possessing a deep commitment to defending their homeland. As the Italian forces neared Adwa, Menelik made a decisive move, positioning his army strategically in the mountains surrounding the town. The Ethiopian army was ready, their resolve hardening with each passing day. The battle that followed would prove to be a turning point not just in the war, but in the history of the African continent. In the face of overwhelming odds, Menelik's forces achieved a resounding victory, shattering the Italian army and forcing them to retreat. It was a victory that would echo throughout Africa and the world, signaling that the colonial powers were not invincible and that the spirit of resistance could not be easily crushed. The triumph at Adwa was a moment of immense significance for Ethiopia and for Africa as a whole. It marked the first time that a European colonial power had been decisively defeated by an African nation, shattering the myth of European invincibility. For Ethiopians, it was a moment of national pride and vindication, confirming their place in the world as a sovereign nation, free from foreign domination. But it was also a moment that would inspire movements of resistance across Africa, as other nations saw that colonialism could be resisted and defeated. The victory at Adwa was more than just a military triumph. It was a reaffirmation of Ethiopian identity and independence, a symbol of defiance against the forces of colonialism. Menelik's leadership, the unity of the Ethiopian people, and their unwavering commitment to defending their land had proven that even in the face of overwhelming odds, victory was possible. The battle would be remembered not only for its military significance, but for the powerful message it sent to the colonial powers that their ambitions were not assured, and that the fight for freedom and sovereignty would continue. In the wake of the stunning victory at Adwa, Ethiopia's triumph sent ripples across the African continent and beyond. For the first time, the colonial powers were forced to confront the reality that their imperial ambitions could be challenged, even by a nation they had considered backward and primitive. The victory at Adwa was not just a military success. It was a symbolic moment, a statement that reverberated far beyond the borders of Ethiopia. Yet, the battle's aftermath revealed that the struggle for Ethiopia's survival was far from over. Menelik's victory would mark a turning point in the nation's history, but the road ahead was fraught with new challenges, both from within and from without. The immediate aftermath of the battle was one of jubilation and national pride. Ethiopia had, against all odds, defeated the Italians and preserved its sovereignty. This was no small achievement, especially at a time when colonial powers were steadily carving up the African continent. For the Ethiopian people, Adwa became a symbol of resistance, a moment of collective triumph that united the nation in ways that had never been seen before. Menelik II, the architect of the victory, was hailed as a hero, his leadership seen as the catalyst for a national movement that had successfully repelled an invading force. However, while Ethiopia had secured its independence, the victory at Adwa did not bring immediate peace or stability to the region. The Italian defeat was a significant blow to European colonial ambitions in Africa, but it also led to a series of complex geopolitical developments that would shape the future of the Horn of Africa. The most pressing of these developments was Italy's response to its humiliation. Far from accepting the loss, Italy was determined to regain its prestige and avenge its defeat. The Italian government, now under a new leadership, began to make preparations for a second invasion of Ethiopia, this time with the goal of securing a more lasting foothold on the continent. Though the Italians would not immediately attack, the specter of future conflict loomed large over Ethiopia's victory. Menelik, ever aware of the precariousness of Ethiopia's situation, understood that the victory at Adwa was not the end of his country's struggles, but rather a brief respite. While Ethiopia had successfully repelled one colonial power, the country was still surrounded by European-controlled territories, and the balance of power in the region remained unstable. Ethiopia's borders, though intact, were vulnerable, and Menelik's task of securing his nation's future would require not just military acumen, but also careful diplomacy. The years following the battle would be marked by Menelik's attempts to solidify Ethiopia's position on the international stage. The emperor understood that, in order to maintain Ethiopia's sovereignty, he needed to garner international recognition of his nation's independence. This meant navigating the complex world of European diplomacy and securing alliances that could help protect Ethiopia from future invasions. Menelik's diplomatic efforts were aimed at gaining recognition from the European powers, particularly Britain and France, who had significant influence in the region. Britain, already engaged in its own imperial ambitions in East Africa, saw the importance of keeping Ethiopia as an independent buffer state between British-controlled territories and Italian interests. To this end, Menelik engaged in negotiations with the British, seeking to secure their support and recognition of Ethiopia's sovereignty. Though Britain was hesitant to directly challenge Italy, the British government recognized the strategic value of an independent Ethiopia and sought to avoid further conflict in the Horn of Africa. The negotiations, however, were complicated by the competing interests of the various colonial powers in the region. France, for instance, had its own interests in the area, particularly in its holdings in Djibouti, and it was wary of Britain's growing influence. While Menelik was skilled in diplomacy, the process of securing international recognition was slow and fraught with difficulty. Ethiopia's victory at Adwa had stunned the European powers, but had not ended their desire to expand their influence in Africa. The balance of power in the region remained delicate, and Menelik found himself caught in a web of competing interests. Despite his best efforts, Ethiopia's sovereignty remained tenuous, and the threat of renewed Italian aggression remained ever present. At the same time, Ethiopia faced internal challenges that threatened to undermine the nation's unity. Though Menelik had successfully united the various ethnic groups within Ethiopia to resist the Italian invasion, the divisions that had existed for centuries within the country were not easily erased. Ethiopia was a diverse nation, with numerous ethnic groups, languages, and traditions, and the challenge of maintaining unity in the aftermath of the war was immense. Menelik's authority was based not just on his military success, but on his ability to balance the competing interests of the different regions of Ethiopia. The country's various provinces had their own local rulers, and many of them saw Menelik's central authority as a threat to their power. In the years after Adwa, Menelik struggled to maintain the delicate balance of power within Ethiopia. The regional rulers, or nobles, who had rallied to Menelik's cause during the war, began to assert their independence as the immediate threat of Italian invasion receded. The central government in Addis Ababa struggled to maintain control over these local rulers, many of whom were becoming increasingly resistant to the authority of the emperor. This internal strife, posed a significant challenge to Menelik's efforts to create a unified Ethiopia. Despite these challenges, Menelik's leadership continued to be a stabilizing force for the country. His commitment to maintaining Ethiopia's independence remained unwavering, and he worked tirelessly to modernize the country's infrastructure and military. He understood that the survival of Ethiopia depended not just on military victories, but on the ability to strengthen the nation's economy and institutions. Menelik's efforts to modernize Ethiopia were significant, including the establishment of new schools, the construction of roads and railways, and the development of a national postal system. These efforts laid the foundation for a more modern and unified Ethiopia, though the challenges of governance and internal conflict would continue to plague the nation for years to come. Meanwhile, Italy's desire for revenge simmered beneath the surface. Though the defeat at Adwa had been a blow to Italian pride, it had not extinguished the country's ambitions in Africa. Italy's renewed efforts to challenge Ethiopia would eventually culminate in the Italo-Ethiopian War of 1935 to 1936, a conflict that would see Ethiopia once again come under threat from European power. Yet, in the years following Adwa, Ethiopia's victory remained a powerful symbol of resistance, and Menelik's leadership continued to inspire those who sought to defend their sovereignty against colonial powers. In retrospect, the years following Adwa represent a complex period in Ethiopia's history. The victory at Adwa had given the nation a hard-won sense of pride and confidence, but it also revealed the deep complexities of the country's internal and external challenges. The victory had secured Ethiopia's independence for the moment, but the forces of imperialism were far from defeated. The struggle for Ethiopia's survival continued, as the nation faced not only the threat of foreign invasion, but the difficulty of consolidating power within its own borders. In the years that followed, Ethiopia would continue to navigate the difficult terrain of geopolitics and internal division, but the memory of Adwa would endure as a beacon of hope and resistance in the face of overwhelming odds. The years that followed the victory at Adwa were marked by a delicate balancing act for Menelik II and Ethiopia. While the battle had secured Ethiopia's sovereignty and sent shockwaves through the colonial powers, the aftermath revealed that independence was not an invincible shield, but a fragile state to be preserved through constant vigilance and diplomacy. The victory had brought national pride, but the challenges of the years ahead would test Menelik's leadership, as well as the strength and unity of Ethiopia itself. In the immediate aftermath of Adwa, Ethiopia was celebrated as the first African nation to defeat a European colonial power, and Menelik II became a symbol of defiance against imperialism. However, the nation's victory also drew the attention of other European powers who, though stunned by the defeat of Italy, were unwilling to accept the status quo. The geopolitical landscape in Africa was shifting rapidly, and Ethiopia, while victorious, was still surrounded by colonies and territories under European control. The fragile nature of Ethiopia's position was highlighted by the fact that the victory at Adwa did not immediately lead to a cessation of hostilities or diplomatic recognition by European powers. Instead, the aftermath saw an intensified focus on the country's international standing, as Menelik sought to gain recognition of Ethiopia's independence from the European powers that still held sway over the continent. Menelik's primary concern after Adwa was the survival of Ethiopia in the face of further imperial ambitions. Though the Italians had been defeated, their colonial desires had not been entirely extinguished. In fact, Italy's defeat at Adwa only fueled its desire for retribution, leading the Italians to pursue alternative means of gaining a foothold in Ethiopia. At the same time, other European powers, notably Britain and France, continued to exert influence in the region, each with their own imperial ambitions. For Menelik, the task of safeguarding Ethiopia's independence was not just a matter of military strength, but also of diplomatic maneuvering. The emperor understood that in order to ensure the long-term survival of Ethiopia, he had to navigate the treacherous waters of European diplomacy and secure international recognition. Menelik's diplomatic strategy was based on pragmatic alliances with European powers, particularly Britain and France. Britain, with its extensive colonial holdings in East Africa, recognized the strategic value of a strong, independent Ethiopia. The British were wary of further Italian attempts to invade Ethiopia, as such an outcome would destabilize the region and potentially lead to conflict with Britain's own interests in the Horn of Africa. Menelik, ever the shrewd diplomat, sought to secure Britain's support by emphasizing Ethiopia's role as a buffer state between British-controlled territories and Italian ambitions. Though Britain was reluctant to challenge Italy directly, it did see the value in an independent Ethiopia and was willing to support Menelik in his efforts to safeguard the country's sovereignty. France, too, was an important player in the diplomatic equation. France had colonial interests in the region, including its control of Djibouti, and it was concerned about the balance of power in the Horn of Africa. Menelik's efforts to secure French recognition of Ethiopia's independence were vital to preventing the collapse of his diplomatic strategy. However, the French were more hesitant to engage with Ethiopia than the British, as their interests in the region were more focused on their own colonial territories rather than the preservation of Ethiopian sovereignty. Still, Menelik's diplomacy was characterized by a combination of careful negotiations and strategic alliances, and while his efforts were not always successful, he was able to secure some measure of recognition for Ethiopia on the international stage. One of the most significant diplomatic victories for Menelik came in 1900 when he secured a formal recognition of Ethiopian sovereignty from the major European powers. The signing of the agreement with the powers of Europe marked a key moment in Ethiopia's history, as it affirmed the country's status as an independent, sovereign state in the eyes of the international community. This recognition was a crucial step in ensuring Ethiopia's long-term survival, as it prevented further attempts by colonial powers to annex or undermine the country. However, the recognition came at a price. The international community, while acknowledging Ethiopia's sovereignty, also insisted that the country remain neutral in the ongoing struggles between European powers in Africa. This neutrality, while vital to Ethiopia's survival, would prove difficult to maintain in the face of growing tensions between European powers and Italy's continuing ambitions in the region. Internally, the challenges facing Menelik were no less daunting. Though the emperor had successfully united Ethiopia's diverse ethnic groups in the fight against the Italian invasion, the unity forged in the fires of war began to fray in the years that followed. The Ethiopian empire was vast, and its people were made up of numerous ethnicities, each with its own language, customs, and local loyalties. The regional rulers, known as nobles, who had supported Menelik during the Italian invasion, began to assert their independence once the immediate threat from Italy had passed. The decentralization of power in Ethiopia had been a fact of life for centuries, and Menelik's efforts to centralize authority were often met with resistance from the nobility. While Menelik's leadership had been crucial to Ethiopia's success in the battle against Italy, maintaining the unity of the country in the years following Adwa proved to be a formidable challenge. The nobles, many of whom had been granted territories in exchange for their support during the war, began to view Menelik's centralizing efforts as a threat to their autonomy. They resisted any attempts to curtail their power, and in some cases, actively sought to undermine Menelik's authority. This internal strife created a volatile political environment in Ethiopia, one that was further complicated by the emperor's health issues. Menelik, who had been in his early 60s at the time of the Adwa victory, began to suffer from increasingly severe health problems. As his health declined, the emperor's ability to govern effectively was compromised, and the political stability of Ethiopia began to unravel. In 1913, Menelik's health had deteriorated to the point where he was no longer able to effectively govern. The emperor's declining health forced him to step aside in favor of his successor, Empress Tetu, and a regency was established under the leadership of Menelik's cousin, Ras Betwadet, to oversee the day-to-day affairs of the government. The regency, however, was short-lived, and by the end of the year, Menelik's successor, Emperor Ieyasu, assumed power. Iyasu's reign, though short, marked a new phase in Ethiopia's history. His ascent to the throne was hailed as a sign of a new era of leadership, and his youth and vigor were seen as a potential source of strength for Ethiopia in the years to come. However, the country was still faced with many of the same challenges it had faced during Menelik's reign, including internal divisions, regional conflicts, and a looming threat of foreign intervention. The years following Menelik's abdication would see Ethiopia's political landscape continue to evolve, but the legacy of Adwa would continue to resonate as a symbol of resistance and defiance against colonial rule. In the broader context of African history, the period following the victory at Adwa represents a crucial moment in the struggle for African independence. The victory, though significant, did not mark the end of Ethiopia's struggles. Instead, it set the stage for a new phase in the nation's history, one that would see the challenges of maintaining independence, navigating international diplomacy, and managing internal divisions take center stage. Menelik's legacy, while marked by triumph, was also marked by the difficulty of sustaining that triumph in a world still dominated by imperial ambitions. As the years passed after the victory at Adwa, Ethiopia found itself navigating an increasingly complex web of internal divisions and external pressures. The triumph had secured the nation's independence and protected it from immediate colonial encroachment, but it also revealed the fragility of Ethiopia's political cohesion. Menelik II, the architect of Ethiopia's resistance, had ensured that the country remained free from foreign domination, but the forces he had united in the heat of battle began to fracture in the aftermath of the war. The victory had united the diverse ethnic groups within Ethiopia in their shared purpose of defending their sovereignty, but it was becoming evident that such unity was difficult to sustain without the looming threat of invasion. The years following Adwa would be marked by a complex interplay of regionalism, shifting alliances, and the difficulties inherent in governing a vast, diverse empire. The immediate aftermath of the battle saw Ethiopia basking in the glory of its unprecedented victory. However, while the external threat from Italy had been repelled, the internal challenges were growing more pronounced. Menelik's greatest strength had been his ability to unite the country's various factions, ethnic groups, and regional powers under a single cause: the defense of Ethiopia's independence. But the unity forged in the heat of war proved to be fragile in peacetime. As the threat of foreign invasion receded, the disparate regional powers began to assert their autonomy, with local rulers questioning the central authority of Menelik's government. Ethiopia was, in many ways, a patchwork of different ethnic groups, each with its own traditions, languages, and local leaders. The emperor's efforts to create a strong, centralized state faced significant resistance from the regional nobility, who saw their power and privileges under threat. While Menelik had worked tirelessly to unite the various ethnic groups of Ethiopia in their shared resistance against Italy, the country's political structure had long been characterized by decentralization. Ethiopia's feudal system, in which local nobles wielded considerable power and autonomy over their territories, created a complex political landscape. The central government, though theoretically in charge, had limited control over the distant provinces. Menelik had been able to exercise authority through a combination of diplomatic acumen, military might, and the support of the nobility. However, once the immediate threat of foreign invasion disappeared, the regional rulers began to push back against the emperor's authority. One of the greatest challenges Menelik faced in the aftermath of Adwa was managing the diverse ethnic groups within Ethiopia. While the country's unity had been forged in the crucible of war, maintaining that unity in peacetime was far more difficult. The various ethnic groups of Ethiopia, including the Amhara, Tigray, Oromo, and others, each had their own distinct identities and grievances. These regional differences, which had been temporarily set aside in the face of a common enemy, resurfaced as the pressure of external threats diminished. The Oromo, for example, had long struggled for greater representation in the central government, feeling marginalized by the more dominant Amhara elite. Similarly, the Tigray region, which had played a crucial role in the defense of Ethiopia, felt that its contributions were not adequately recognized by the central government. The rise of regionalism in the aftermath of Adwa was exacerbated by Menelik's declining health. By the early 1900s, Menelik was increasingly frail, and his ability to govern effectively was compromised. His health problems, which had been apparent even during the Italian invasion, became more pronounced in the years following Adwa. Menelik's decision-making became slower, and his physical condition made it difficult for him to maintain control over the country's increasingly fragmented political structure. As his health deteriorated, Menelik's authority began to wane, and he was forced to rely more on his advisors and the regional rulers to maintain order. This shift in power dynamics was not without its complications. The nobility, sensing an opportunity, began to assert greater control over their territories and challenge the authority of the central government. In 1913, Menelik's health reached a critical point, and he was no longer able to govern effectively. The emperor, recognizing the need for a smooth transition of power, appointed Empress Tedu to serve as regent during his absence. However, this decision was not without its problems. Empress Tedu, though a strong and capable leader in her own right, faced resistance from the nobility, many of whom saw her leadership as a challenge to their own power. The regency was short-lived, and by the end of the year, Menelik's son, Emperor Ieyasu, ascended to the throne. Ieyasu, a young and energetic ruler, was seen as a potential source of strength for Ethiopia, but his reign would be marked by political instability and the challenges of consolidating power in a divided country. Emperor Ieyasu's reign was shaped by the political turmoil that followed Menelik's abdication. While Ieyasu was eager to assert his authority and bring about reforms, he quickly found himself at odds with the regional nobles, who were unwilling to relinquish their autonomy. The central government struggled to maintain control over the provinces, and Ethiopia's political landscape became increasingly fragmented. Regional rulers began to assert their independence, with some openly defying the emperor's authority. The challenge of uniting the various ethnic groups and regions of Ethiopia, which had been temporarily overcome during the war, resurfaced as the central issue of Ethiopian politics. Ieyasu's attempts to consolidate power were further complicated by the growing influence of foreign powers in the region. Though Ethiopia had secured its independence from Italy, the country remained vulnerable to the ambitions of other European powers, particularly Britain and France. Both Britain and France had colonial interests in the Horn of Africa, and they were keen to ensure that Ethiopia remained neutral in the ongoing struggles between European powers. Menelik's diplomatic efforts had been focused on securing Ethiopia's place as an independent buffer state between British and French territories, but Ieyasu found himself caught in the middle of competing European interests. The pressure from foreign powers, combined with the internal divisions within Ethiopia, made it difficult for Ieyasu to assert his authority effectively. Despite these challenges, Ieyasu attempted to modernize Ethiopia and strengthen its central government. His efforts included reforms to the military and the introduction of new technologies, as well as attempts to centralize control over the country's economy. However, these efforts were hampered by the entrenched power of the regional rulers, who were resistant to change. The regionalism that had become so prominent in the aftermath of Adwa continued to undermine Ieyasu's efforts at governance. His attempts to create a more centralized state were met with fierce opposition from the nobility, who saw his reforms as a threat to their power. As the years went by, the challenges of governing Ethiopia became more pronounced. The country's political structure, based on a combination of feudalism and decentralization, made it difficult to implement the kind of reforms necessary to modernize the nation. The central government was often at odds with the regional rulers, who had little incentive to cooperate with the emperor. The ethnic divisions within Ethiopia also posed a significant obstacle to national unity. Though Menelik had been able to unite the country under the banner of independence, that unity was fragile, and the forces of regionalism, ethnic division, and political ambition soon began to tear at the fabric of the nation. The external pressures on Ethiopia were not to be ignored either. Though the immediate threat from Italy had been vanquished, the Italian desire for revenge never truly disappeared. The defeat at Adwa had been a humiliation for Italy, and the country's imperial ambitions in Africa were not easily extinguished. In the years following Adwa, Italy began to reassert its presence in the Horn of Africa, seeking to gain control of the region through diplomacy and when necessary, military force. The possibility of a renewed Italian invasion was a constant source of anxiety for the Ethiopian government, which was already struggling with internal divisions and political instability. As Ethiopia grappled with these internal and external challenges, the legacy of Adwa continued to loom large over the nation's consciousness. The victory at Adwa had secured Ethiopia's independence, but had also set the stage for a new phase in the country's history, one marked by political instability, regional divisions, and the continuing struggle to maintain sovereignty in the face of both internal and external pressures. The dream of a unified, modern Ethiopia was elusive, and the forces that had once united the country in the fight against foreign domination were now being tested by the complexities of governance and the competing ambitions of regional rulers. The period following the ascension of Emperor Menelik II to the throne marked a pivotal chapter in Ethiopia's modern history, a time of political turbulence, reform, and a renewed struggle to maintain the fragile unity of the nation. Menelik II's legacy, although still fresh in the minds of the Ethiopian people, had been overshadowed by the growing divisions between the center and the provinces. The victory at Adwa, a symbol of resistance against imperialism, now seemed distant as Ethiopia found itself grappling with internal fractures, the demands of modernization, and the ever-looming threat of foreign intervention. When Menelik came to power in 1913, he was young, energetic, and full of aspirations for a more centralized and modern Ethiopia. The emperor's ambition to steer the country toward progress was rooted in a vision of a unified state that could stand independently among the world's powers. He sought to break the stranglehold of regionalism that had long defined Ethiopian politics and implement reforms that would strengthen the central government. However, his reign was marred by constant resistance from the local nobles, or nobility, who controlled various regions of Ethiopia with great autonomy. These nobles, who had played a crucial role in the victory at Adwa, had been granted lands and privileges in exchange for their support, but they were unwilling to relinquish their power to the central government. The centralization of power was not an easy task in a country like Ethiopia, where local rulers had long held sway over their territories. Menelik II had been able to maintain a delicate balance of power by allowing these regional lords a degree of autonomy, while still securing the overall unity of the state. But Menelik's desire to consolidate control and reduce the influence of the nobility faced stiff opposition. The emperor's attempts at centralization were seen as a direct challenge to the traditional feudal structure that had governed Ethiopia for centuries. The nobles, who had grown accustomed to their power, were loath to cede control to the emperor in Addis Ababa. The challenge of governing Ethiopia was further complicated by the political fragmentation within the country's diverse ethnic groups. Though the Adwa victory had united the Ethiopian people in their resistance against Italian aggression, the underlying ethnic and regional tensions remained. Ethiopia was not a homogeneous society, but rather a collection of different peoples, each with their own languages, cultures, and histories. The Amhara, Tigray, Oromo, and other groups each had their own distinct identities, and these differences had often led to conflict in the past. Menelik II had been able to keep these tensions in check through his leadership, but Menelik's attempts to strengthen the central government brought them to the fore once again. The Oromo people, one of Ethiopia's largest ethnic groups, had long felt marginalized by the dominant Amhara elite. The centralization of power in Addis Ababa was seen by many Oromos as an extension of Amhara domination. The Tigray, who had played a significant role in the defeat of the Italians at Adwa, also felt that their contributions had not been sufficiently recognized by the central government. The regional rulers, who were often drawn from specific ethnic groups, now found themselves in competition with one another for political influence. This ethnic fragmentation made it increasingly difficult for Menelik to maintain control over the country. In addition to these internal divisions, the specter of foreign intervention loomed large over Ethiopia. Although the immediate threat from Italy had been vanquished after the defeat at Adwa, European powers had not abandoned their interests in the Horn of Africa. Italy, in particular, remained intent on recovering its prestige and expanding its influence in Ethiopia. The Italian government, under the leadership of the new fascist regime, sought to avenge the humiliation of Adwa and reassert its control over the region. In 1922, Mussolini's rise to power in Italy marked the beginning of a new era of Italian aggression toward Ethiopia. The Italian desire for revenge, combined with their ongoing efforts to expand their colonial empire, cast a long shadow over Ethiopia's political landscape. Despite the internal strife and external threats, Emperor Iesu's early reign was marked by several important reforms aimed at modernizing Ethiopia. Iesu sought to introduce new technologies and institutions that would strengthen the nation and prepare it for the challenges of the modern world. His efforts included attempts to improve the country's infrastructure, particularly its roads and railways, which had long been underdeveloped. He also worked to modernize Ethiopia's military, recognizing the need for a more professional and technologically advanced army to defend the country against future foreign invasions. One of Iesu's most significant reforms was his push for modernization in education. He believed that Ethiopia needed to develop a more educated and skilled workforce if it was to compete in the global arena. Under his leadership, Ethiopia saw the establishment of new schools, including technical and vocational institutions, aimed at providing the country's youth with the skills necessary for industrialization. However, Iesu's efforts in this area were met with resistance from the conservative elements of Ethiopian society, many of whom saw modernization as a threat to their traditional way of life. The nobles, particularly those from rural regions, were wary of the changes Iesu sought to implement, fearing that they would undermine their power and influence. Another area where Iesu sought to modernize Ethiopia was in the development of its economy. The emperor recognized that Ethiopia's agrarian economy was insufficient to sustain a growing population and modernize the country's infrastructure. He looked to industrialization as a way to diversify the economy and provide new sources of wealth for the nation. To this end, Iesu encouraged foreign investment and sought to establish a more diversified industrial base. He also worked to develop Ethiopia's natural resources, including its mineral wealth, which had largely gone untapped. Despite these efforts, Iesu's reign was marred by political instability and a growing sense of disillusionment among the Ethiopian people. The emperor's failure to maintain control over the country's regions and his inability to consolidate power led to increasing dissatisfaction among the population. The regional rulers, who had initially supported Iesu's rise to power, began to question his leadership and sought to assert their independence once again. The feudal structure of Ethiopia, which had been temporarily weakened during the Adwa campaign, was now reasserting itself in the form of regional conflicts and struggles for power. The division between the central government and the regional elites grew more pronounced as Iesu's authority waned. The nobles, who had initially supported the emperor's reforms, began to view his centralization efforts with increasing suspicion. They saw the emperor's attempts to modernize the country as a threat to their traditional privileges, and many began to resist his authority. The central government, which had been struggling to maintain control, was now faced with a growing rebellion from within. The challenge of uniting Ethiopia's diverse ethnic groups and balancing the power of the central government with that of the regional rulers proved to be an insurmountable task for Iesu. In 1916, the political situation in Ethiopia took a dramatic turn. Iesu, who had been viewed as a potential reformer and modernizer, was deposed in a coup orchestrated by a coalition of nobles and military leaders. The coup, which was largely driven by dissatisfaction with Iesu's rule and his failure to consolidate power, marked the end of his reign and the beginning of a new phase in Ethiopian history. After his deposition, Iesu was placed under house arrest, and a new emperor, Haile Selassie, was installed on the throne. Haile Selassie, who would go on to become one of Ethiopia's most iconic leaders, inherited a country beset by internal divisions, political instability, and a looming threat of foreign intervention. The fall of Iesu marked a turning point in Ethiopia's modern history. While Menelik II's victory at Adwa had secured the nation's independence, The political struggles that followed exposed the deep-seated divisions within Ethiopian society. Iyasu's efforts to centralize power and modernize the country had been stymied by the entrenched interests of the regional nobility and the growing influence of ethnic divisions. The challenge of maintaining a unified Ethiopia in the face of these internal and external pressures would remain one of the country's defining struggles for the years to come. In retrospect, Iyasu's reign serves as a reflection of the larger challenges faced by Ethiopia in the 20th century. The tension between modernization and tradition, the struggle for national unity in a diverse society, and the ongoing threat of foreign intervention. The fall of Iyasu, while a moment of political upheaval, also paved the way for the leadership of Haile Selassie, who would continue the work of maintaining Ethiopia's sovereignty and modernizing the nation. The political landscape of Ethiopia was forever altered in the years that followed the deposition of Emperor Iyasu. The reign of Iyasu had promised a future of modernization and centralization, but the failure to consolidate power and unite the country's regional factions left Ethiopia vulnerable to political instability and external pressures. After Iyasu's removal in 1916, Ethiopia entered a period of transition, one that would eventually lead to the rise of Haile Selassie, who would become one of the most significant and enduring figures in Ethiopian and African history. Haile Selassie, born Ras Bitwadad Tizima, ascended to the throne in 1916 after the coup that removed Iyasu. His reign would mark a new chapter in Ethiopia's political evolution, and he would face the daunting challenge of restoring order and unity to a country that had been plagued by ethnic divisions, regional rivalries, and the lingering legacy of feudalism. Haile Selassie's rise to power was not just the result of a political struggle, but also a symbolic moment in Ethiopia's ongoing battle for sovereignty and self-determination. At the time of his coronation, Haile Selassie was only in his mid-30s, and he brought with him a sense of youthful energy and ambition that contrasted sharply with the instability of the years preceding his reign. However, his task would prove difficult. The political situation in Ethiopia was precarious, with regional lords wielding significant power and influence. The nobility, who had long controlled the country's provinces, were often in direct conflict with the central government. The feudal structure of Ethiopia, which had defined the country for centuries, was deeply entrenched, and Haile Selassie's efforts to centralize power and implement reforms would face fierce opposition from these local rulers. One of Haile Selassie's first challenges was to solidify his authority within the capital, Addis Ababa, and to win the loyalty of the regional nobles. Many of these nobles had supported Iyasu's rise to power, but with the emperor's fall, their loyalties were uncertain. Haile Selassie understood that, in order to secure his position, he needed to forge alliances with the key regional lords, or ras dukes. This meant negotiating with them, offering them concessions, and ensuring that their interests were protected while simultaneously working to reduce their power. This delicate balance of diplomacy and power was to become a hallmark of Haile Selassie's reign. While Haile Selassie worked to navigate Ethiopia's political landscape, he was also aware of the broader geopolitical situation. The victory at Adwa, though a symbol of resistance, had not secured Ethiopia's place in the world permanently. European powers continued to have interests in the Horn of Africa, and the country remained vulnerable to foreign intervention. Italy, still wounded by its defeat at Adwa, was determined to reassert its influence in the region. The growing tension between the colonial powers in Africa, particularly Britain, France, and Italy, left Ethiopia caught in the middle of competing imperial interests. Haile Selassie's diplomacy was shaped by his understanding of these geopolitical dynamics. He sought to maintain Ethiopia's independence by balancing the competing interests of the European powers while strengthening his country's international position. Haile Selassie worked tirelessly to establish diplomatic relations with various foreign governments, including those of Britain and France, as well as the League of Nations. His diplomatic efforts were not solely driven by the desire for recognition, but also by the need to ensure that Ethiopia remained an independent and sovereign state, free from foreign domination. Internally, Haile Selassie sought to modernize Ethiopia's institutions and systems. One of his key goals was to reduce the power of the regional lords and establish a more centralized state. The decentralized feudal structure of Ethiopia, which had worked for centuries, was no longer sufficient for the modernizing nation Haile Selassie envisioned. To accomplish this, he began a series of reforms aimed at centralizing the country's administration, improving the country's infrastructure, and modernizing the military. These reforms would prove critical to Ethiopia's survival, especially as the country was confronted by renewed Italian aggression. One of Haile Selassie's most significant efforts was the introduction of a new constitution in 1931. This constitution, which was modeled on European parliamentary systems, marked a significant departure from the feudal structure that had governed Ethiopia for centuries. The new constitution granted the emperor broad executive powers while establishing a bicameral legislature composed of appointed and elected representatives. While the constitution did not provide for full democracy, it was a step toward modernizing Ethiopia's political system and reducing the power of the regional lords who had long held sway over the country. This move was met with mixed reactions. The nobility, who had long been the power brokers in Ethiopia, were resistant to these changes. They saw the centralization of power as a direct threat to their autonomy and privileges. Nevertheless, Haile Selassie pressed forward with his reforms, knowing that the country's survival depended on a strong central government capable of managing both internal and external challenges. Haile Selassie also understood the importance of modernizing Ethiopia's military, particularly in light of the growing threat from Italy. While the country had successfully repelled the Italians at Adwa, the Italian military had undergone significant modernization in the years since. Haile Selassie worked to modernize Ethiopia's army, introducing new technologies and training programs to bring the military into the modern era. This effort was not without its difficulties. Ethiopia was a poor nation, and the resources available to modernize the army were limited. Despite these challenges, Haile Selassie's efforts to strengthen Ethiopia's military would become a key element in the country's defense against future aggression. While Haile Selassie focused on internal reforms and military modernization, the shadow of Italian expansionism loomed ever larger. In 1935, Italy, now under the fascist rule of Benito Mussolini, invaded Ethiopia once again. This time, however, the situation was vastly different. Italy's military had been significantly modernized, and Mussolini was determined to avenge the defeat at Adwa and reassert Italy's dominance in Africa. The invasion was swift and brutal, and despite Haile Selassie's efforts to modernize Ethiopia's military, the country was no match for the might of Italy's forces. The invasion of 1935 marked one of the darkest chapters in Ethiopia's history. Haile Selassie, who had worked so tirelessly to preserve Ethiopia's independence, was now faced with the harsh reality of an external force seeking to crush his country. Despite the overwhelming odds, Haile Selassie refused to surrender. His resolve in the face of the Italian invasion would become legendary. Rather than retreating, he took his case to the League of Nations, where he made an impassioned plea for Ethiopia's sovereignty and called for international support. His speech, delivered in 1936, remains one of the most powerful moments in the history of the struggle for African independence. Despite Haile Selassie's eloquent appeal, the League of Nations failed to take meaningful action. Italy's military might proved too great, and Ethiopia was occupied by Italian forces. Haile Selassie was forced into exile, marking a temporary end to his rule. However, the invasion would not break the spirit of the Ethiopian people. Resistance to Italian occupation remained strong throughout the period of Italian rule, and Haile Selassie's exile would ultimately serve as a rallying point for the Ethiopian resistance. In 1941, with the help of the British, Haile Selassie was able to return to Ethiopia and reclaim his throne. The period of Italian occupation was a traumatic chapter for Ethiopia, but it also galvanized the Ethiopian people in their struggle for independence. Haile Selassie's leadership and determination, even in exile, became a symbol of the resilience and unyielding spirit of Ethiopia. His eventual return marked not just the restoration of his rule, but also the reaffirmation of Ethiopia's sovereignty. Haile Selassie's reign, though interrupted by the Italian occupation, would continue to shape Ethiopia's trajectory well into the 20th century. His efforts to modernize Ethiopia and establish it as a respected member of the international community would remain central to his legacy. Yet, his reign was not without its challenges. The struggle for unity in Ethiopia, the tension between modernization and tradition, and the ongoing pressures from external forces all shaped the course of his rule. But through it all, Haile Selassie remained a steadfast leader, committed to the idea of Ethiopia as a sovereign nation, free from foreign domination, and a symbol of African pride and independence. The years following Haile Selassie's return to the throne in 1941 marked a critical phase in Ethiopia's history. The Italian occupation had left deep scars on the nation, not only in terms of physical destruction, but also in the psychological toll it had taken on the Ethiopian people. However, Haile Selassie's triumphant return was a moment of renewal, signaling not just the restoration of the monarchy, but the reaffirmation of Ethiopia's sovereignty and the possibility of rebuilding the country from the ashes of occupation. Despite the difficult circumstances, the early post-occupation years represented a period of optimism, as Haile Selassie began the difficult task of re-establishing Ethiopia's independence and laying the groundwork for modernization. The return of Haile Selassie to Ethiopia in 1941, after the defeat of the Italian forces by the British, was a moment of both political and emotional significance. Ethiopia's resistance during the occupation had remained strong, and the memory of defiance against foreign rule provided the nation with a sense of unity that transcended the immediate political challenges. Haile Selassie's return from exile was not simply a political event. It was a symbolic restoration of the country's identity. His return signified the endurance of Ethiopian sovereignty and the determination of its people to resist any form of colonial subjugation. However, the challenges that Haile Selassie faced upon his return were monumental. The Italian occupation had devastated the country, leaving much of the infrastructure in ruins. The country's economy was in shambles, and its institutions had been severely weakened. Haile Selassie faced the monumental task of rebuilding the country from the ground up, both physically and institutionally. The task was made all the more difficult by the fact that Ethiopia was still a largely agrarian society, with limited access to modern technologies and resources. The central government, which had been weakened by years of occupation and internal strife, was in need of reform and revitalization. Haile Selassie had no illusions about the enormity of the task ahead, but he was determined to restore Ethiopia to its former strength. One of the first areas of focus for Haile Selassie was the reconstruction of the country's infrastructure. Roads, bridges, and communication systems had been destroyed during the Italian occupation, and the country was in desperate need of modernization. Haile Selassie understood that in order for Ethiopia to move forward, it needed to establish a strong and functional infrastructure that would enable economic growth and modernization. His government began the process of rebuilding roads and railways, improving communication networks, and restoring key infrastructure that had been destroyed. The rebuilding process was slow, and the resources available were limited, but the determination to rebuild was palpable. Haile Selassie understood that Ethiopia's future depended on its ability to modernize and integrate with the rest of the world. At the same time, Haile Selassie sought to modernize Ethiopia's economy. The country's economy, which had been heavily dependent on agriculture, needed diversification in order to thrive in the post-colonial world. Haile Selassie believed that industrialization was the key to Ethiopia's economic future. His government began to encourage foreign investment, particularly in the areas of mining, agriculture, and manufacturing. While Ethiopia's economy remained primarily agrarian, Haile Selassie understood that industrialization was necessary to create a more sustainable and diversified economic base. To this end, his government worked to attract foreign expertise and investment while also focusing on developing Ethiopia's own industrial capacity. Haile Selassie's modernization efforts extended to the realm of education as well. Recognizing the importance of an educated populace in building a modern nation, the emperor sought to expand access to education and improve the quality of schooling across the country. Under his leadership, Ethiopia saw the establishment of new schools, including primary, secondary, and technical institutions. Haile Selassie believed that education was not only key to economic development, but also to the preservation of Ethiopia's sovereignty. By promoting education, he hoped to build a generation of Ethiopians capable of contributing to the nation's modernization and ensuring its continued independence. The emperor's modernization initiatives, however, were met with resistance from some quarters. The Ethiopian aristocracy, which had long enjoyed significant power and influence, was wary of the changes that Haile Selassie sought to implement. The nobility had long controlled the country's regions, and the emperor's efforts to centralize power were seen as a threat to their authority. Additionally, many in the rural areas, where the majority of Ethiopians lived, were suspicious of the changes that were being introduced. These rural communities had their own customs and traditions, and the rapid pace of modernization was sometimes seen as a disruption of the country's traditional way of life. Despite the resistance, Haile Selassie pushed forward with his reforms. One of the most significant aspects of his reign was his effort to transform Ethiopia into a modern state, one that could stand on equal footing with the countries of Europe and the wider world. Haile Selassie's vision for Ethiopia extended beyond mere infrastructure and economic development. He sought to modernize Ethiopia's political system as well, and he began to implement reforms that would eventually lead to the creation of a more centralized and efficient government. In 1955, Haile Selassie introduced a new constitution that granted greater powers to the central government and set the stage for a more modern and inclusive political system. The 1955 Constitution was Ethiopia's first written constitution and represented a significant step forward in the country's political development. It established a parliamentary system of government, with a bicameral legislature composed of an elected lower house and an appointed upper house. The Constitution also granted greater political rights to citizens, including the right to form political parties and participate in elections. While the new constitution did not establish a full democracy, it was a significant move toward modernizing Ethiopia's political system and ensuring greater political participation. Haile Selassie's political reforms were not limited to the central government. He also sought to extend the reach of the government to the rural areas, where the majority of Ethiopia's population lived. The emperor understood that in order for the central government to be effective, it needed to have a presence in every part of the country. To this end, he sought to improve the country's administrative infrastructure, creating a more efficient and accessible system of local governance. This effort was aimed at reducing the power of the regional lords and increasing the central government's control over the country's provinces. While Haile Selassie's reforms represented a bold vision for Ethiopia's future, the process of modernization was far from smooth. The emperor faced significant challenges in implementing his reforms, particularly in the face of entrenched opposition from the nobility and conservative elements within society. The Ethiopian aristocracy, which had long enjoyed significant privileges, was not easily willing to relinquish its power. Similarly, many rural Ethiopians were suspicious of the changes being introduced, and the rapid pace of modernization sometimes caused friction between the central government and local communities. Additionally, the challenges of modernization were compounded by Ethiopia's international position. Though Haile Selassie had successfully defended Ethiopia's sovereignty during the period of Italian occupation, the global balance of power was shifting. The Cold War, which dominated international politics in the mid-20th century, created a new set of challenges for Ethiopia. Haile Selassie worked to navigate the complex geopolitical landscape, maintaining Ethiopia's non-aligned stance while balancing relationships with both the United States and the Soviet Union. Ethiopia's position as a beacon of African independence was becoming increasingly important as the continent moved toward decolonization, and Haile Selassie sought to position his country as a leader in the African liberation movement. The emperor's leadership was instrumental in the formation of the Organization of African Unity, OAU, in 1963, which aimed to promote unity among African states and advocate for the end of colonialism on the continent. Haile Selassie's role in the creation of the OAU cemented Ethiopia's position as a key player in the African liberation movement. His advocacy for Pan-Africanism and his unwavering commitment to the sovereignty of African nations earned him respect across the continent. However, despite his international stature, Haile Selassie's leadership was not without its detractors. The growing discontent within Ethiopia, particularly from the rural areas and the working class, would eventually come to a head in the 1970s, leading to the emperor's downfall. By the time of Haile Selassie's death in 1975, Ethiopia had undergone significant changes, but the challenges of modernization and governance were far from over. His reign had laid the foundation for a modern state, but the tensions between the central government and regional powers, as well as the growing discontent of the Ethiopian people, would soon lead to a new chapter in the country's history, one that would see the rise of a Marxist regime and the eventual end of Ethiopia's monarchy. Despite the difficulties he faced and the criticisms of his rule, Haile Selassie's legacy remains one of determination, vision, and an unwavering commitment to Ethiopia's independence. His reign helped steer Ethiopia toward modernization, and his role in the Pan-African movement continues to inspire leaders across the continent. By the mid-1960s, Ethiopia was caught in the throes of a new phase of political tension and social unrest. The country, under the leadership of Emperor Haile Selassie, had made significant strides in modernization and development, but beneath the surface, discontent was brewing. The emperor's vision of a modern, centralized, and economically viable Ethiopia had succeeded in some respects, but it had also exposed the fragility of a system built upon traditional structures of power. While Haile Selassie's efforts to modernize the state were acknowledged globally, domestically, his regime increasingly faced opposition from various segments of society. The political, economic, and social structures that had served Ethiopia for centuries were being stretched to their limits. In the rural areas, the government's slow reforms, the persistence of feudal structures, and the growing gap between rich and poor were creating resentment among the peasantry. In the cities, an emerging intellectual class, influenced by global currents of thought, began to question the legitimacy of the emperor's rule. It was clear that the challenges that had plagued Ethiopia during the first half of the 20th century were far from over. Haile Selassie's political reforms, particularly the 1955 constitution, which aimed to centralize power and create a more modern state, had failed to fundamentally address the issue of land redistribution. In Ethiopia, as in many parts of the world, land was the primary source of wealth and power, and the country's agrarian economy meant that the vast majority of the population worked the land. The emperor had made some efforts to improve land tenure and expand education, but these initiatives were largely insufficient in addressing the core issues faced by Ethiopia's rural populace. Large landholders, mostly from the aristocracy or the military, continued to control vast swathes of the country's arable land, while the peasants who worked it were often left in dire poverty. These conditions created a sharp divide between the rural poor and the elite, a divide that would eventually become one of the main sources of unrest in the coming decades. In addition to the issue of land, the economic disparities in the country were growing. Haile Selassie's economic policies had focused on modernization and the attraction of foreign investment, but these policies often favored urban elites and foreign businesses, while the rural poor saw little benefit. Industrialization, which was central to the emperor's vision for Ethiopia, did not materialize as quickly or effectively as hoped. The country remained largely agrarian, and the benefits of development were not evenly distributed. Urban centers like Addis Ababa saw the growth of a small middle class, but the vast majority of Ethiopians lived in rural areas and remained mired in poverty. The emperor's failure to address these economic inequalities created dissatisfaction that would later fuel the growing opposition to his regime. Meanwhile, the intellectual class, many of whom were educated abroad, began to adopt Marxist and socialist ideologies, which found fertile ground in Ethiopia's discontented urban population. As the Cold War intensified, the influence of Soviet and Chinese ideologies grew across Africa, and the younger generation in Ethiopia began to view the emperor's regime as an outdated monarchy that was out of touch with the needs of the people. Universities in Ethiopia became hotbeds of political activity, and young intellectuals, students, and workers started to organize against Haile Selassie's government. Among them were future revolutionary leaders who would come to embody the demand for change and the rejection of imperialist and capitalist influences. The emperor's attempts to suppress dissent and maintain control over the country became more pronounced in the 1960s. Political opposition, particularly from the left-wing movements, was systematically silenced. The government became more oppressive, and opposition groups, especially those calling for land reform and greater social justice, were labeled as communists or subversives. The military, which had been a strong pillar of Haile Selassie's rule, became increasingly alienated as well. In the late 1960s, the Ethiopian military, which had long enjoyed privileged status, began to show signs of discontent. Many soldiers were dissatisfied with the lack of proper equipment, poor working conditions, and low pay. The relationship between the emperor and his military forces, which had been a cornerstone of his rule, was beginning to unravel. While Haile Selassie struggled to retain control, Ethiopia's political landscape was shifting rapidly. The country's urban centers were beginning to experience political awakening, and social movements calling for greater democracy, land redistribution, and workers' rights gained momentum. At the same time, the rural population continued to bear the brunt of the country's inequities. It was in this context of profound dissatisfaction that the Ethiopian Revolution began to take shape. Led by young officers within the military, intellectuals, and students, the revolution aimed to dismantle the old feudal order and replace it with a more egalitarian, socialist society. One of the key drivers of this movement was the issue of land. Ethiopia's agrarian economy was deeply entrenched in a feudal system, where land was concentrated in the hands of a small elite. The rural population, especially the peasants, lived in near serfdom. Landlords controlled vast estates and imposed heavy taxes on the peasantry, which led to extreme poverty and hardship. Calls for land reform, which had been circulating since the early 20th century, became a central issue in the revolutionary rhetoric. The demand for land redistribution was not just a call for economic justice, but also a symbolic rejection of the aristocracy and the emperor's failure to address the needs of the majority of the population. The movement toward revolution gained strength in the early 1970s, particularly after the government's failure to respond to the needs of the people became more apparent. Economic stagnation, political repression, and social inequality led to widespread dissatisfaction. The Ethiopian military, which had been a loyal instrument of Haile Selassie's rule, became increasingly disillusioned. In 1974, a group of young military officers, known as the Derg, staged a coup that effectively removed the emperor from power. The revolution had arrived, and Haile Selassie's reign, which had lasted for over half a century, came to a violent and abrupt end. The overthrow of Haile Selassie marked the end of the Ethiopian monarchy and the beginning of a new era in the country's history. The Derg, which had initially promised to uphold order and bring about a more equitable society, soon revealed its own authoritarian tendencies. The revolutionary leadership, although initially driven by the ideal of social justice, soon became embroiled in a brutal campaign of repression and violence. The Derg's ambitions for land reform were implemented through a series of brutal measures, and the country descended into a period of chaos and bloodshed. Haile Selassie, who had once been hailed as the Lion of Judah and a symbol of African independence, was relegated to the status of a prisoner in his own country.